Good day, class. For the third video lecture for the course, we will be discussing Orientalism and Edward Said, one of the first theorists that we will be discussing in the course. So, Edward Said is the author of our main text, one of our main texts, Orientalism, which was first published in 1978. So, Edward Said is not a historian. He has training in the humanities, so that's why in his book you will see that his sources are literary sources. And throughout his life, he advocated for Palestinian self-determination and rule. So he said in his book that this book of his is kind of a personal project for him because as an Asian, as an Asian who lives in West Asia or what we know as Middle East, he and his people have always been represented in Western media, especially because of the relationship of the US to the Middle East and the other European countries also to the Middle East throughout his life and throughout the history of his people. So it was very important for him to look at uh, the beginnings, to the reason why there is such a distinction between West and East, and why is it that these representations still exist during his time. So first, to contextualize the discussion that we will have today, let's read this quote from The Awakening of Japan in 1905 by Tenshin Okakura. Has not the West as much to unlearn about the East as the East has to learn about the West? Perhaps the fact that the history of Eastern civilization is still a sealed book to the Western public may account for the great variety of opinions held by the outside world concerning our present conditions and future possibilities. So as you know, the context of this is, of course, the interest of Western powers to open up Japan, and also the future of Japan when it has westernized in the latter part of the 1800s. No, but I want us to look at that first question here or sentence. Has not the West as much to unlearn about the East as the East has to learn about the West? This question comes from the fact that during this time and until the present, the West, as we call them collectively, the European countries and the the United States and the countries there in the north. No, so we have discussed all these categories in the last meeting and also in the last synchronous session. So they have an idea of what the East was, basically because of the history that for example, Europe is adjacent to Asia, and they've all had cultural and historical connections in the past. While that is a fact, it is also a fact that the relationship between Asia and the what we call the post-colonial countries are not just of cultural and historical connections, but also of domination. The purpose of this presentation is to look at not just the physical or the actual connections, but also of discursive relations, wherein throughout history and until the present, it is the process of knowing, no, so quote on knowing each other. No, for example, Asians knowing the rest of the world and the West knowing about Asia is still in process. And in the process of knowing each other, stereotypes have formed. Okay, stereotypes and opinions on how each should develop have has been formed. So we have also mentioned here how here in this course how a post-colonialism looks at this trajectory of human history wherein the West have dominated the rest of the world through imperialism and colonialism, and in effect have homogenized the history of development of the world into one direction, which is capitalism and democracy. Okay, so why is it that the West has much to unlearn about the East? And why is it, where do their learnings or ideas of the East have come from? And how did they use these representations, this knowledge about the East, to practice and to continue the dominant relationship that they have with the East through time? So to reiterate this focus of post-colonialism as a reaction against the grand narrative of Western civilization through an increasing awareness of what is left out or made invisible. In addition to that, and in contrast to that, post-colonialism also focuses on what is visible, meaning uh, what can we see as the relationship of the West and the East, and question why is that. So that's where the work of Orientalism comes in. Okay, so for this presentation, we will try to define Orientalism as it was discussed by Said, and then try to give examples, and then contextualize Orientalism and the study of post-colonialism, and finally to look at some critiques to post-colonialism and how are these relevant to our studies in the social sciences. So those are the objectives that you need to look out for as you listen to this presentation. So I ask you to read Orientalism by Said, first published in 1978 and republished in 1985 and 2003. So I have also mentioned in the previous presentations that this work is considered as the founding text of contemporary post-colonialism. But interestingly also, the post-colonialism as a field also took off from the critiques to this work by Said. So according to Green in 2008, it was the first time that culture was linked inexorably to colonialism, because Said's analysis is very based on the idea that culture and cultural domination, cultural hegemony is related to colonialism. Like culture is a reason why the East has been dominated by the West for the longest time. So it also marked the linguistic turn in post-colonial studies, no, because it focused on the use of language. No? So Said, in your reading, he mentions many literary works, and some of it we don't know, of course, because this is not, maybe this is not part of our curriculum when we were in primary and secondary school, but for many people in the West, these are very familiar. But uh, he got his ideas, or he is inspired, and he used some ideas of Foucault and Gramsci in his work Orientalism. And most importantly, he looked at the use of language of the sources that he was looking at in order to argue for what he is arguing, that we will be discussing later on. And as I've said, he also focused on the Foucauldian, on Foucault's work, and looked at the Foucauldian analysis of knowledge in relation to power in his work Orientalism. Okay. So in an article, Holiday 1993 notes that the idea of Orientalism that we will be discussing in a bit predates the publication of Said's Orientalism. He is noting that there is Orientalism before Said said that there is Orientalism. So what is Orientalism in this sense? So Orientalism in this sense is basically the West, or Europeans, colonial masters, or people from uh, the countries that colonize other peoples in the world, their works, their literary works, their study about the East, or in general, just how they look at the East. So Orientalism predates Said's Orientalism in 1978. But what is important about Orientalism by Said is that it started a new debate with its use of literary critical methodology in his analysis. So you look at Said's work, and even in the introduction, so he mentions many different literary sources, not just literary sources, but also pieces of art, motifs that are used in European and American art, music, etc. Okay? But, gayang sabi ko kanina with the linguistic turn, this was a very important shift. Okay? Not just in post-colonialism, but also in the social sciences in general. So, if you remember, I think it's supposed to be discussed in History 100, the linguistic turn in the social sciences and how it has affected the analysis or even the content of the study of many social sciences. So, in that way, Orientalism is very important. So, we now go to defining what is Orientalism. Okay, so in the last lecture, we defined the colonialism and imperialism. So we have somehow established that there is a relationship and there is a unique history of the peoples of the world that are either part of the colonized areas in the world, or those who are responsible for the domination of many parts of the world because of many motivations. Okay, so Orientalism is a study of that relationship. Okay, so you can look at Orientalism in many ways or in many senses. So the first is yung na-discuss ko in the previous slide, which is what is done by Orientalists. So according to Said, anyone who studies or writes about the Orient and even teaches about the Orient that is not from the Orient is an Orientalist. Okay? So he contextualizes his work ng 1800s, a latter part of the 1800s, and up to the present, his present, which is 2003. 1978 to 2003. So he looks at these practices of the West or the colonizers wanting to know more about the East. So last video, we have discussed about the diaspora that happened because of colonialism. Na napabilis nito yung pag-migrate or paglipat ng mga tao, especially from colonized countries to yung sinasabi nilang mga empty territories daw outside Europe because of several motivations such as, for example, economic. They want more resources, they want more gold, silver, etc. Pero ang kasabay ng proseso ng actual na domination or occupation of countries, of colonizers to colonized countries ay yung diaspora nga, especially during the 1700s to the 1800s when yung colonialism na sinasabi natin ay majority nito ay settler colonialism. Okay? But throughout the history of colonialism and imperialism, merong kind of mysticism, kumbaga, at pagiging myth yung image ng Orient. Okay, so you will see this in works, even in Greek works, where they tried to describe what is Asia, what is over there in the East. So that's why the East is the East, Asia is Asia. It's because of a term that they use to refer to where the sun rises and where the sun sets. Okay, so the sun rises in the East, no? So the word for that eventually became Asia. So they even have ideas before of Asia Minor and Asia Major, no, depending on what area they know, okay, and what area is very far from them. Okay, so throughout European history, Asia has been the unknown. Okay, they cannot go there, they don't know where to go, but they have travelers who went to India, they have travelers who went to China, and then when they go back to Europe, it's like, oh, it's another world out there. Okay, so throughout their history, may ganitong interest na sa Asia, especially when European countries ano tawag dyan? Colonized Asian and African and the Americas territories. Okay, so Meron ng interest na ganun. So through time, according to Said, this interest became more systematic in the sense that there there was actual expeditions going to colonized areas so that they can study the peoples. They go back and they publish travelogues, they paint or do art or do plays, theater plays based on Asian themes, okay, throughout history. So this is very general. No, there are no, I won't be asking specifics from you, but the context is that, yun nga, they wanted to know more about their colonies. Okay, they wanted to know more about the place where they get spices from. Okay, they wanted to know more about these people. So Said says that this is the first motivation for scholars in the 1800s to the 1900s up to even up to the present to know more about the East. So ngayon kasi, 'di ba, even for example, if we see pictures, if we see um, articles about no, this specific practice in China, this specific practice in Japan, it's still very interesting. Especially because, for example, kung hindi pa tayo nakapunta doon, ganyan. So, imagine na time na walang internet, ganyan. So, they wanted to know more about these places. Especially dati kasi when yun nga, travelers go back to Europe, parang may air of mysticism. Parang ang magical naman doon. Ganon. Ganon yung image, kumbaga. Right? So, through time, parang ano, di ba? Parang very innocent. Okay? But Orientalism by Said is noting that this interest in Asia is not at all innocent. Okay? Why? Because number two, it is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and most of the time, the Occident. Orientalism is a process of producing an identity, creating an identity that is consistent to one's biases and stereotypes. So, sabi ko nga kanina, throughout time, they had an interest in Asia. And uh, through time, they began to pile up like sets of knowledge about the East that they now use to justify, for example, colonization. Or ang sabi nga ni Said, yung Orientalism mismo, itong knowledge na na-produce nila about the East, this was even before they wanted to justify imperialism later on. Okay, so ano ibig sabihin ng ontological and epistemological distinction? Dito papasok yung term na other. Okay? The Orient became the other of the Occident. Okay? They produce or they create their identity based on their difference to the Orient. Okay, so what kind of difference we will see later. But at this point, the idea is that there is a difference between these two. Na yes, pare-parehas tayong tao, but may difference. Okay, so yung difference na yon may kasama siyang ideology, may kasama siyang yun nga, biases and stereotypes. Okay, so because of that style of thought, Orientalism eventually and simultaneously, okay, became the style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So, in simple terms, now that you know the other, now that we know about Asia, okay, and we know that we are superior over them, then it follows that we should dominate them. We should have authority over them. Okay, so yan yung ibig sabihin niya. So these are the major ideas that we will be going back to later on. So to add to that third point, Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. Essentially, Orientalism talks about the representation of the East in the West. Okay, it talks about how we are viewed. Okay, I say we because we are a part of a country that has been colonized before. So how we, post-colonial peoples, have been represented by our colonizers. Okay? So, isa sa mga pinaka-importanting addition ni Said sa post-colonialism is the idea that these representations are not innocent. Okay? So when a European draws or paints, for example, picturesque countryside in China and then puts image of people there, that is not innocent. Why? Because it is feeding the the stereotypes of Western people, of Asian peoples, for example. Okay, for example, what stereotype kung he portrayed Chinese, for example, the Chinese countryside as just with as a picture up, yun nga, very beautiful, but yung nakalagay sa picture mga mahihirap na magsasaka. Okay? So that is consistent with their stereotypes with on Asians. Okay? So other stereotypes we will discuss later. Okay? Another thing that is very important here is that it is very you can see it everywhere. Okay, Orientalism is everywhere. You can see it in the institutions of the colonial system. You can use it. You can see it in the way people talk about the East. You can see it in academic works. Yan, yung imagery, yung nabanggit ko kanina. Doctrines, and even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. It can be official. Okay? Orientalism can be official. So there are several questions of why we should study Orientalism. So if at this point it is not yet clear, okay, ito yung mga sinusundan or ito yung mga tinatry na sagutin na questions ng Orientalism. Okay, has imperialism ended? So last time this was our answer. We said this was our question. So we asked if there's such a term as post-imperialism. So our answer is no. So we substantiate that answer by looking at the process of Orientalism. Is knowledge objective? Meaning, if you want to know about something and there are truths that you discover, okay, and then you present your truths, you present your knowledge, is that process always objective? Okay. Another question is, are representations reflections of reality? Okay, so if we are represented, for example, in American TV, is there such a thing as, an Asian representation? Or representation of Asians? Not just Asians, representation of women. May mga naiisip ba kayo na tropes or yung lagi mo na lang nakikita na plot point na involving Asians or stereotypes? Okay, so we are trying to argue here that those stereotypes are not just productions of the contemporary world, that these stereotypes, these representations have existed and are actually produced because of colonial relations. So syempre, we also argue, or we also look at this as Orientalism as a post-colonial study. So how? So Orientalism can be characterized through this Western prejudice in the context of the binary opposition between the Orient and Occident in Western thought that is made possible and is maintained by academic discourses. Okay, so I have mentioned this a while ago that Orientalism is the way, or the way people from colonized countries are being represented by people that are from the countries of colonizers. Okay, so for example, Americans writing on the Philippines during the time that they colonized the Philippines. Okay, ito yung isang importante na feature ng Orientalism. That it said that the prejudice of the West against the East was actually a product of its reproduction, the reproduction of the prejudice, the reproduction, the reinforcement of the prejudice of Westerners to people in the East through time. Meaning they had these ideas about us, and through time they use it, and actually it made its way into academic discourse. Academic discourse actually reinforced this idea that the West, the West is better than the East. Okay, so this idea of discourse discussed by Said is actually, as I've said a while ago, Foucauldian. So discourse, according to Foucault, so this is one aspect of how he defined discourse, is that it's a Western prejudice. It's a Western prejudice. It's an epistemological device which constructs its objects of knowledge through the establishment of a practice of a certain linguistic register. So one thing that we can say there is that it's producing something based on its use of language. Okay, so discourse in discourse can be understood in many ways, right? So when you say discourse, it's a conversation. So in normal ways, we use that term as such. But discourse, in terms of Foucault, is actually a body of knowledge. Okay, it's a body of ideas. Yan. A body of ideas that actually tells you about, for example, medical discourse. Okay, so medical discourse, you can just know medical discourse, for example, when you study medicine, when you want to be a doctor. So you will be privy to its jargons. Okay, so ngayon na nag-aaral kayo ng social sciences, of course, there are many discourses in the social sciences that you already know. So there's a discourse of gender. Okay, now what we're doing here is to look at colonial discourse. Okay, so simply it looks at that. But what is important about discourse is in the following slide. So key ideas that we need to look at in discourse are these terms: production and reproduction, restriction and limitation. So according to this quote, the discourse always involves a form of violence in the way it imposes its linguistic order on the world. Knowledge has to conform to its paradigms in order to be recognized as legitimate. So for example, for medical discourse, there has been, as a discipline, for example, medicine as a discipline and also as a practice, since it has been studied and practiced for a very long time, it has now a set of jargons. Okay, so many of that we don't know if we are lay persons, but if you're a doctor, of course, you're required to know of those things. So, may mga practices, may mga procedures that has been done for a very long time. So, that's why outside that discourse, you will say that it's not medical discourse if it's not consistent with what is in medical books, for example. So, that's why you have fields such as Oriental medicine. Why? Kasi itong Oriental medicine, for example, with its uses of some herbal medicine, acupuncture, it's not considered as a part of the modern scientific, or sorry, contemporary scientific practice of medicine. Okay? So, that is a discourse. Okay? Medicine itself as a discipline is a discourse. So, ang sabi dyan, it involves a form of violence in way it imposes its linguistic order on the world. So therefore, for example, if you cannot find these terms, these medical terms in, for example, in Oriental medicine, there is a chance that it will be dismissed by doctors, by practitioners of the medical discipline. Okay, so it's very much related to an idea on the idea of discipline. Okay, so ano yung production and reproduction doon? So every year, the world trains thousands and thousands of millions of doctors. Okay, and these doctors, kahit anong bansa pa man yan, isa lang yung hindi naman isa, parang merong uniform na way of training them. Okay, so that it is possible for example, for a doctor in the Philippines to also practice in other countries. Why? Because there's a scientific, there's a science to it. It's uh, it's established. Okay? So, meaning, that's why there are other categories such as Oriental medicine, traditional medicine. When you look at these categories or other fields, they are different than medicine that is, modern medicine. Modern medicine. Because itong modern medicine, meron siyang sarili niyang established procedures, and knowledge. So therefore, kung may papasok na ibang knowledge na hindi, para sa kanila, ay hindi scientific, hindi siya masyado pang napag-aralan, they will consider that another category, an other, okay? An other. So yun yung sinasabing form of violence doon. Because you're not consistent with our established processes, you need to be able to have a category of your own, or you cannot call yourself medicine. Okay? So that's how violence is, so violence is characterized. So doon nakikita yung restriction or limitation that you cannot for example, you cannot have a medical license only if you practice Oriental medicine or traditional medicine. Okay? It's also a restriction because para bang nakabox na yung discourse. Okay? But I also want you to understand discourse as a process. Kasi nga nakalagay dyan, production, reproduction, restriction, limitation. It is a process. And this process is actually seen in Orientalism. So let's look at the next slide and try to understand Orientalism in this lens. So if it's not clear now, I will try to clarify again in the next few slides. Okay, essentially, this course, as discussed by Foucault and also as applied by Said in Orientalism, is essentially about power and knowledge. Okay? So, in my example kanina of the discipline of medicine, okay, you can be considered an expert if you are, for example, if you're a doctor, okay, if you're a doctor, you have studied and you're specializing in a specific branch of medicine, okay, so you can be considered an expert. Okay, so therefore, if you're an expert on something, you can be considered for interview in several TV shows. For example, they want to talk about diabetes, okay, and then you're an expert on that. Okay, so you have that kind of authority to talk about something because you know it, you have studied it. Okay, so therefore, as for example, tayo sa social sciences, if you are in the academe, you will be joining conferences, you will be presenting, okay, only when you know about what you're talking about. You know more than others on what you're talking about. Okay? So, that in itself is a reflection of how power is tied with knowledge. So, you know something. You can have some power. So, this is one aspect of power that you know something about it. You are an expert on it. And therefore, you talk about it. Okay? So, in terms of colonialism, in Orientalism, power and knowledge is there when at one point in history, the West or the Europeans assumed power as actual power, meaning the domination, meaning they occupied other countries. Okay, for example, the Philippines. The Spaniards colonized the Philippines. They set up a government here. They made Filipinos low class in terms of social and economic status in comparison to the Spaniards. So the Spaniard is always on top and the Indios will always be at the bottom. So there's power there. It's a the relationship that where one is dominant over the other. Okay? So that's power. But what Foucault said, and what is applied by Said, is that power is not just raw power like that. No, it's not just power in terms of military might, but it's also power that could be discursive and power that can be related to knowledge. Okay? So according to that, kung makikita nyo tong arrow na to, power produces forms of knowledge, where knowledge is now, knowledge constitutes modifying, redistributing, and stabilizing categories of power. It actually reinforces itself through knowledge and vice versa. So, anong example nito? Ang sabi ni Said, Orientalism is a discourse because of this. Okay, so look at this, that sabi ko kanina, the colonial masters, the colonized peoples, colonial masters, the Spaniards, no, para madali. The Spaniards had power over the Filipinos. Okay? Sabihin na lang natin Americans, no, kasi yun, may example ako sa Americans. Americans have power over Filipinos in the 1900s. They colonize us. Okay? So, the Americans during that time, actually, bago pa sila pumunta ng Pilipinas, may mga pumunta na dito ng mga Americans, telling Americans about what Filipinos are, aning sitwasyon ng bayan, aning sitwasyon ng Pilipinas noon. Okay? So, in that way, they produce forms of knowledge about the Philippines. Okay? So, nakita nila na tayo ay kolonya ng Espanya, mahirap pa mga Pilipino, wala masyadong forms of knowledge, wala masyadong education. Okay? So, itong knowledge about the Filipinos became the justification of their colonial project in the Philippines. Okay? So, power produces knowledge because of their specific privilege, and kasi meron silang pera at forces, manpower to go to the Philippines and study the Philippines, they produce some kind of knowledge about the Philippines. So, that knowledge was, yun nga yung sinabi ko kanina, na we are colony of Spain, mahirap pa rin tayo, ganyan. And eventually, and also sabi ko kanina, diba, eventually and simultaneously, this became a justification of them having power over us. So, this power over us actually established some institutions. So, itong institutions, as you know from your, kung nagsoksay 197 na kayo, or saan nyo ba mamimit yung institutions? Okay. But institutions are not government institutions lang, but institutions such as education in general, religion in general. The family is an institution. So this power that the Americans have over the Philippines have established certain institutions. For example, education. They knew from their research, sabihin na nating research tong knowledge, that Filipinos do not have good educational institutions, education. So, they changed the educational system. They taught English to Filipinos. And you will see in post-colonial studies that the education of colonized peoples in another language is actually also very violent. Yung violence dito, hindi siya actual na patayan, ganyan. But violence in terms of muting many voices. Okay? For example, when you teach English and not teach Filipino, you are privileging English because it is the more superior language, and therefore you have later on, until the present, you will see that English is, a standard of education. Kapag hindi ka marunong mag-English, sinasabing hindi ka edukado. Ganyan. So, yun, that could be one effect of these educational institutions. these educational institutions would now be instruments to control the subjects. Okay? So, power constitutes subjects. Meaning, nung nalaman nila na mahirap tayo, they had the power, okay? They now constituted us as subjects. Okay? They now constituted us as people who need to be dominated, who need to be governed. And you can see that in colonial discourses, saying that the Philippines need the US. Okay? Because, yun nga, we are very backward. Okay? So, look at those stereotypes and look at those adjectives that are used, that I use to describe Filipinos. Because those are the adjectives also used by Americans to describe their subjects. Okay? And those adjectives that they use to describe the subjects are reflections of what they view, of how they view us. They view us as backwards. So, sino yung progressive din kung tayo ay backwards? Sila. Okay? So, if we do not have good educational institutions, ano yung standard nila ng educational institutions? Sila. Okay? So, this power knowledge relationship that established institutions establish control, okay, nagtutuloy-tuloy siya ng relationship of domination. Kasi through time, they know something about us and then they compare us to them. Okay? Nare-reinforce yung identity nila na sila yung superior. Okay? And if their idea or knowledge that they are superior are reinforced, then there is more justification of control of certain subjects. Okay? Yun ay simple na napaka-simple na definition or example for the power knowledge idea of Foucault. Okay? And that's how colonial discourse worked according to Said. Okay? Another example of this power knowledge is that, for example, the way European countries governed homosexuality at one point in their history. Okay? So, of course, you have the government, which is very patriarchal, they see themselves as very, during that time, they're very democratic na. Democratic, rational, ganyan. And very patriarchal and very heteronormative. Okay? So you have the government and several institutions already existing, like the family. The family is, the nuclear family, for example, is heteronormative, meaning you have two people, a female and a male, that would procreate and have children, and then you have a family. Okay? So, through time, ganun yung system. Okay? So, ganun yung alam ng mga tao. And this knowledge that is the only acceptable form of family, or that being a woman and being a man are the only acceptable genders there are, okay, gives power or gives credence to itself. Meaning, alam mo na ito lang yung tamang forma ng pamilya, ito lang yung mga genders. So, you impose it upon yourself or the society imposes upon you that you should only be a man, you should only be a woman, and there are gender stereotypes behind it. So, sino yung subjects dito? Mga tao. Okay? So, that knowledge reinforces itself, okay? And it also produces limitations to what could be. Okay? So, it produces limitations on what could be. Kasi you cannot be outside of the spectrum of that. Walang spectrum actually. You cannot be outside of that binary of man and woman. So now, if you're outside of that, ngayon na mamamanifest in real terms yung power nung institutions na na-form. Even your family will control you. Even your family will say that that is not right. And then eventually, European governments would have ways to medically cure homosexuality because they consider it as a disease. That was their knowledge. That was their That was what they know. Okay? So, matagal-tagal bago nawala itong stigma sa homosexuality na to the point na hanggang later 1900s, meron pa ring mga batas against homosexuality. Because of the power of that idea, of that knowledge, na dalawa lang ang genders. Okay? So, power produces knowledge, knowledge reinforces it, and then, yeah, so as you can see, it cannot just be applied to the colonial discourse. Okay, so it's very hard to explain it. It's very hard to explain it. Yeah, without, yeah, so it's very hard to explain it. So if you have questions regarding this, we can discuss it in the synchronous session. Okay, so how is power and knowledge related in Orientalism? So according to Said, it has different aspects, yung power. There's political power, there's intellectual power, cultural power, and moral power that all leads to all lead to um, the idea of Orientalism being very dominant in the in European and American society. Okay, so for example, number one, you have political power. Nabanggit ko yan kanina, na of course, they have established themselves as the colonial or imperial establishment. So therefore, they have the raw power. They have the power because they are the government. Okay? So according to Said, this power of Orientalism is also reinforced by intellectual power because they believe that, as you know, right, the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, the Enlightenment all happened in Europe. So, and even before that, they believe that because of their forms of government, because of the color of their skins, they are the more superior race. Okay, through time, this has been uh, affirmed by the disciplines, the sciences, the fields of study and knowledge that they also have established or formed, such as, for example, comparative linguistics, anatomy, modern policy science. So I think I have mentioned in this class how anthropology became a handmaiden to colonialism, and some of you anthropology majors also mentioned that in the form that I have asked you to sign or to answer before the class started. Okay, where there are actual when Americans, for example, went to Cordillera, what they did to our indigenous peoples is to measure the circumference of the head, measure the length of the arms, and other tests just to prove, or, just to prove that they are more superior than our race. In not just because they said so, but also because of anatomy. Okay? Because of science. Okay? Said said that this is how the sciences, the academic discourses, the academe, reproduced representations of the East in the West. Okay? Another is cultural. Sabi ko nga kanina, even before the Enlightenment, pagdating nila sa kanilang mga, sa Americas, pagdating nila sa Pilipinas, at saka sa iba pang mga naging kolonya, ay yung idea that they are superior culturally. Especially, for example, sa Pilipinas, makikita mo yung mga sources na nagsasabi na they're baffled at why women are topless in the Philippines. Okay, sa kanila, syempre, balot na balot yung mga kababaihan because of their because of the modesty nga dapat na meron ng kababaihan. So therefore, they equated na mga kababaihan sa Pilipinas ay they are anong tawag? May term sila eh. But they're not modest. Okay? They're not like our women. Ganyan. So they always talk in terms of our and they. Okay? Sila at kami. Okay? So ganun din when they went to Asian countries, to China, to Japan, to India, for example, they compared their their classics. For example, what are the classics of Europe? The Greeks, of course, and the works produced during the Enlightenment, to the, for example, religious and mythological um, works that you can find in Japan, in China, in India, even in the Philippines, and our form of writing. So they compare that. Okay? So dala-dala kasi nila yung mga biases nila. So pagdating nila sa mga bansa na ito, dala-dala nila itong mga biases. So therefore they think na these people are more backward than us because they are different. Yun yung unang conclusion. Okay? In Said's book nga, in the beginning, in the introduction, he says that um, knowing the Orient, the process of knowing the Orient, is not an innocent one, meaning the West did not know the East or did not want to know about the East because they want, a harmony so that they can live together. No. They knew about the East so that they could compare themselves and they could justify what they are doing to the East. Lastly is the power moral, or the ideas about what we can do and what they cannot do or understand as we do. So the classic example here is, of course, the morality of Christianity that the Spaniards brought to the Philippines. Okay, that they imposed this religion upon us so that we can be civilized. Okay, so that's actually a reflection of how they view us. So these power, political, intellectual, cultural, and moral, are manifestations of Orientalism, and also reflections of how Orientalism has been very, what's the term? It has stayed for very long because of its support from many, many people, many sectors. Okay. However, this support that I'm talking about is sometimes unconscious, meaning people unconsciously do this, orientalize, or have stereotypes of other countries, of other nations. Sometimes it's unconscious, but for the colonial discourse, what Said was saying was that ito yung mga pinanggagalingan ng mga tinatawag na Orientalist. Dito sila nanggagaling. Itong mga knowledge na ito, itong mga differences na ito, dito sila nanggagaling para i-justify yung colonialism at i-present yung East in a certain way. Yan. So these quotes just reinforce what I have been saying a while ago. Now, so Orientalism as a body of theory and practice is the analysis of the means by which discourse constituted the practices of imperialism. That discourse of the other, the discourse of stereotyping the other, or learning about the other so that you can affirm your own identity of superiority. Yan. A Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So I've explained that. And then lastly, the science of the imperialist and colonialist projects of the West. So that's one major point of Said also, that Orientalism is the way that they justified their colonialism and imperialism. The way they justified the violent deeds that they do to natives. Okay? And you could also see that in representations in literary texts, in art, in even in their government documents. Because what Said also says is that these ideas of representations are everywhere. They are held by everybody, everyone in the countries of the colonizers. So anong na-produce nung knowledge about the East? Okay? So we said kanina that power, because of their power over the East, like military power, they have occupied the East. They have produced knowledge on the East. And this is also because they have the privilege. Syempre sila yung may mga ways to disseminate knowledge. They have printing. Okay? They have what you call formal language. That is language used in books. And then they have people who will read the books. Okay? Unlike, for example, pumunta sila sa Pilipinas ng 1800s, hindi nakakapag-aral ang mga kababaihan, lalo na yung mga mahihirap. So, they represent the women. Sabi nila, ang mga kababaihan ay, for example, there are descriptions of women in Manila na nagpa-party lang daw, ganyan. Yun nga, hindi nakakapag-aral. Magaganda mga dilag sa Pilipinas. So, kahit na yung mga ganong sa Manila during that time, sabi nila. So, kahit yung mga ganong description is actually a way of representing the other. Okay, so they published works and they published works, books about the Philippines without even asking the Filipina, ano ba yung tingin mo dito? Walang ganun dati. So ngayon, syempre, the norm is that when you do, for example, a documentary on one country, syempre part ng documentary na yan, dapat i-interview mo, ganyan, so that they would have a voice. Dati wala. Okay? So, that in itself is that is very Orientalist according to Said. So, ang na-produce ng knowledge na ganon because of the unfair, unequal power relations between the East and West are binary oppositions. Okay? So, this binary oppositions is at the core of Orientalism. So, these are sets of structures that highlight the absolute and systematic differences between the East and West. Okay? So, the West and the East support and to an extent reflect each other. So, anong ibig sabihin yan? The East's image is always compared to the West. Meaning, if the East is mythical or religious, okay, then the West is secular. So, binary lagi siya. So, black and white. Ganon. So, etong binary oppositions na to, according to Said, is the basic structure of how the how the West views the East. Okay? So, pag sinabi mong mythical and feminine and religious yung East, makikita mo ito sa napakaraming literary works, makikita mo ito sa government documents, you can even see it in conversations of people. Okay? Because through time, yung sabi ko kanina ba, it's a process. Okay, it was a process of representing the other. So, to the point na meron na silang set of adjectives, kumbaga, that are related to the East. So, these stereotypes that are in the binary oppositions constitute the images of the East in the West. So, why did they do this? Because the East is incapable of defining itself. So, the West would do it for them. Again, that reflects their view of themselves. They want to represent the East because they cannot define themselves. Why? Because they cannot be understood by the West. They do not have the language. So, yun lang yung naging standard ng mga Western people kung bakit kailangan nilang pag-aralan yung East. So, there are many themes in the representation. So, this is from one article by Izadi and Saghayi Beria in 2007. So, this article discussed how the Americans view the people from the Middle East. Okay? So, ito yung mga themes dun sa representation. Ano yung stereotypes ng Orientalism? Ano yung stereotypes ng mga Western people sa mga East? Number one, that they are untrustworthy. Okay? So, unlike, for example, if you are having a contract or having an agreement with a Western, with a fellow American or fellow European, kasi alam mo yung culture ninyo, you will trust them. So, because the Orient or the non-Western or Eastern person is your other, then they're untrustworthy. A theme also in Orientalism is the threat of Islam. So this is specific to the 9/11 attack and the war of terror after, that Islam is considered as a general category for Muslims and also for terrorists. Okay, so that's a theme in representation. That's also, it's not just in 9/11. It was also in the works of in literary works and academic works during the colonial period, when of course Islam then, okay, Islam then had Muslims then had also an empire of their own. Okay, so as an enemy of the Europeans, they also have an image of the Muslims, which is very very unfair, because these Muslim empires, or Muslim um, caliphates, ganyan, and the Ottoman Empire, for example, um, are not much, they are not studies as much as, for example, the Roman Empire, ganyan. No, because hindi Europeans yung bida, ganyan. So you can see that as as a manifestation also of Orientalism. Another is Oriental inferiority and backwardness. So magkadugtong yan, that they always see the East or the colonized peoples as very inferior and backward. So therefore, it justifies their intervention to these countries. So Orientals are irrational. So bakit? Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina na mysticism and also mythical image of the East in the West. Very uh, they see that as very irrational in comparison to their secularism, okay, their enlightenment. And then Oriental submissiveness, because they thought that it's easy to colonize other countries. So they thought that they're just very submissive. They will just follow whatever a Western person will tell them. Strangeness, yun nga yung mysticism and the mythical nature of the East, and the sensuality. No, because they attribute very feminine. This is actually very sexist nga, na they attribute very feminine features to the Orient. And always when they talk about the Orient, even in the colonial times up to the present, they talk about it as for example, a country to be dominated, to be raped, okay, that are terms or the use of language that is very violent against women. Okay? So, ito yung mga themes ng representation na sinasabi ko, na throughout the colonial period up to the present, may mga stereotypes na pasok dito sa walo na ito at iba pa. Syempre, hindi lang itong walo na ito, pero pasok dito. Like for example, when developed countries look at developing countries and see na hindi sila nagde-develop or hindi sila mahirap pa din sila, ganyan, sometimes it's not a case of them being objective, na developing countries are not helping their peoples, but it can also be a way of them reinforcing such ideas or such images of Oriental inferiority or Oriental backwardness. Okay? So, for example, mga foreigners na pupunta sa Pilipinas, sinasabi na wala tayong ganito, ganyan. No? So, it can also be a way of, reinforcing some stereotypes. So, we can have many more examples later on. So those representations also fuel the so-called myths of the other. So according to Orientalism, Orientals can be observed as possessing certain habits of mind, traits of character, and idiosyncrasies of history and temperament. The sum total of these characteristics inclines Orientals towards certain types of action. So as you can see here, yung mga representations na nabanggit kanina, yung backwardness, inferiority, makes it appear as if their actions can be already expected or predicted by the West. Okay? So, again, this is part of the knowledge, the knowledge that they have on the East. Okay, so they produce these certain stereotypes that they reinforce, that they even teach to their children, and is reinforced and justifies what they do to the Orient. So if you know of the St. Louis exposition in 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair in the United States, where the Americans brought some Filipinos and also some living artifacts, as they call it, from colonized countries for Americans to look at. So you if you look here, this is an elephant. Nakalagay visit Asia. Okay? So this is an example of how until the 1900s, the East or Asia is still an unknown frontier or place for many Americans. So they went to this exposition, which is like a living zoo, a zoo of humans. Okay, so this picture is of Bontok Igorots. They reproduced a village in the site where they did the exposition, and they made them do their rituals and dances and music for the Americans to see. So may mga mas malala pa na photos na talagang nanonood yung mga Americans sa mga bontok Igorots na nandun. So this is another picture of an Igorot village in the area. No, so kung makikita nyo kanina may building sa likod. So they actually did this, and was said that some of them died because they're parang syempre hindi sila sanay dun sa climate. Okay, and then actually this did not just happen in 1904. There were several world fair in other countries. So Rizal has had a commentary on this, where Filipinos are always portrayed as our indigenous population. Yung they're not clothed, they are not civilized, they are not Christianized, and Rizal said that this is not the image of the Filipino that he wants the world to see. So as you know, the propagandistas, what they want to show the world is that their knowledge, okay, their talent is at par with European. So that's why they're in Paris. They're Paris doing art and showing in galleries, ganyan. So, but that is the image of the East always being portrayed in the West. That's Orientalism. When they show the evidence of the backwardness, inferiority, submissiveness, etc., yung knowledge nila, when they are able to put evidence on it by, for example, lalo na nung nagkaroon na ng parang evidence through pictures, mas na-reinforce yung idea na, for example, for Americans, ganito pala yung itsura ng mga Pilipino. So, dapat nga na we colonize them, we clothe them, we civilize them, we give them education. Okay, may mga before and after pictures pa nga of Filipinos when nadatnan sila ng mga Americans, and then after their education, naka-Amerikana na sila, ganyan. So, yun yung Orientalism. So, not just in the Philippines, but also in other parts of the world where colonized peoples are constantly being represented by the West as backward, as a group of people that still needs guidance from the West. So what is argued here is that this idea is not just because they want the resources. Okay? So, through time, gumawa sila ng mga justification so that they could continue exploiting resources and so that they could reinforce um, the already very powerful stereotypes that they have known. So it was not just during the colonial times, but also in the contemporary period. No, so we may think that many TV shows and um, many media are woke in the sense that they know about all of these biases, that they are sensitive to portraying race, gender, etc. Okay, there are still shows, there are still um, evidence of this Orientalism. Like for example, in the movie 300, you can see here that they portrayed Xerxes as kind of a bigger man than Leonidas. So Leonidas here and all the Greeks are very buff, ganyan. And then you can see Xerxes. He is tall and big, but you see all of his jewelry there. Ganyan. He has a very strange and actually funny appearance in comparison to the Greeks who are portrayed as very strong, especially yun nung nag-focus sila dun sa 300 na soldiers. And then throughout the movie you see that parang may ano dun parang may elite force ng mga Persians na naka-mask, ganyan, naka-capes and mask. And then they have a giant elephant, ganyan. No, that these are all very mystical. Okay? And yun nga, it's consistent with the idea of the West that the East is very irrational. Kasi may nilagay din sila doon na part na there's like a Xerxes, para siyang may orgy na nagaganap, ganyan. So parang they portray the West through the Greeks and the East through the Persians very differently. Okay? To the point na yun nga, very sexual, parang hindi rational, ganyan, yung East. But for the Greeks, ang pinapakita is kung paano sila plan ng tactics nila. So, it's a very unequal representation of the two. So, kahit na fiction ito, okay, kahit na fictional yung representation, ganyan, you will see how it is important for them to establish this difference between the West and the East in such a way that the West always comes as you know, the winner, of course, the winner of the war, and also as the good guy, always. Okay? So, yeah, isabay nyo pa, idagdag nyo pa dyan yung kung paanong when they put Japanese people on film, it's always the mafia, ganyan. So, actually, hindi na lang yan, ngayon, hindi na lang siya mga American or European series ngayon. You can also see this in Korean drama, na kapag nandyan yung Pilipino, usually, nagtatago yung mga kriminal sa Pilipinas, ganyan. Bakasyunan yung Pilipinas. So, there are several stereotypes that the audience of that form of art or movie understands. Okay? And it reinforces their idea. No, so ito kahit fictional. So as you can see, that's an application of Orientalism in this sense. So I have been mentioning the American colonial period in the Philippines. No, so I studied this and saw that they have academic works like books, journals about the Philippines. So I was interested in that before. What are they writing about the Philippines? So I found that there is a body of work where they are just saying what they are discussing what to do with the Philippines, and when they ask that question, they conclude that they have a duty for Filipinos, for the Philippines, because they see the Philippines as a problem. Okay, the Philippines is a problem for them, and that the Philippines has a problem. So other works would be, for example, this work, Orphans of the Pacific, the Philippines. So sa title pa lang, Orphans, that there we need parents, we need we need a country that would guide us to the right path. Okay. So itong Orphans of the Philippines, or Orphans of the Pacific, the Philippines, it's and other on and all these other academic works, they're actually packaged as yun nga, academic works, objective. So when you think about it, they're very objective, but ngayon pag titingnan mo siya, they're actually representing the Philippines in a certain way. Okay? They are reinforcing um they're reinforcing the stereotypes, the biases, the representations that is consistent even before they came to the Philippines. Okay? So they did the research, ganyan, but they also contributed to the Orientalization of the Philippines in a sense. So I have mentioned a while ago about Islam as a threat, as a theme of representation, and how this was more apparent after the 9/11. So there are actually studies that there is one study that I read about President Bush's speeches after the attack of the Twin Towers in 9/11. So you see here headlines like yan, US attacked, it's war, act of war, because the Americans saw this as assault to them as a people. Okay? Reinforcing the us them division, or the binary opposition between them and between the Americans and the Middle East, which they blamed for this act of terrorism. Okay? So, after this, yun nga, yung study na binanggit ko kanina, the study discussed, looked at speeches of the president and looked at how he described the Middle East, or yung mga sinasabi nilang suspects dito. So, the descriptions were accurate, that they are accurate and consistent to the Orientalist idea that Islam is a threat to the Western world, when they say that yun nga, the terrorists are dangerous, ganyan, they have no regard for human rights, etc., because they want to really divide, or they want to distance themselves from the other. Okay, and as you know, the US always had a stake, or they are always intervening in the affairs of the Middle East, because of this idea that they're the ones who know what is right. They can guide these countries into prosperity, into so that they could stop war, but that did not happen. Okay, but these headlines, yung it's war, act of war, and also the language used by the Americans even after 9/11, and how it has affected the Muslim communities there. So if you have watched the movie My Name is Khan, that's what is portrayed there, no, how they were portrayed after 9/11, that it has affected all Muslims and Arabs around the world. Even you're not Arab, when you just look like you are not from the US and you're Islam, for example, then the stereotypes are applying to you, or are applied to you. That's Orientalism in the contemporary period. So but of course, Orientalism as a work is also critiqued. Okay, one, because the colonial discourse that it talks about is also totalizing, because it makes us believe, or it makes the readers believe, that is everything that happened in colonial discourse. Okay, na to the point na, ayan, generalization. Ang ginawa kasi ni Said is that he read many literary texts and then generalized from that. So that's a big no-no for historians, no, because historians would, at least, no, positivist historians would always want to have other sources, no, other than the literary texts. Okay, And then there is also the critique that Orientalism is very deterministic because it assumes that everyone in Europe is Orientalist, that everyone in Europe has this idea that ang sinasabi kasi na Said, it's inescapable. When you write about the Orient, you're automatically Orientalist. Okay? And then lastly, parang binawi niya raw yung sinabi niya na parang binawi niya yung lahat ng sinabi niya sa book. Because he asked, is it actually possible to accurately represent another culture? Okay? So I think I have quotes here to support this. Yan. So, on generalization, there is a problem of the status of claims from the example of a few texts. So, it dehistoricizes and treats all texts as synchronic, as if they existed in an ahistorical, unchanging, spatialized textual continuum. So, because that's how he discussed it, no, that parang may mali sa causation. Yun yung isa sa critique dito. And then, lastly yun, the emphasis on the textual nature of history threatens the notion of history as an objective discipline. Okay, because Said notes that we need to look at the subjectivity of text. Like, for example, the context, kung saan sila naisulat, ano yung relationship nila sa other text, which is another aspect of his work, which is intertextuality. No, but according to Young, 2016, it threatens the objective aspect of history. Well, ang dagdag ko naman dito is that history as a discipline has evolved through time and it's not confined only to documentary sources. And there are actually histories such as, for example, cultural history na tumitingin talaga sa mga literary texts. Yan. So, ito yung sabi ko na kanina na parang binawi niya yung sinabi niya sa buong book. The question of representation, it does not ask about things such as, is it accurate? Is the text telling the truth about what really went on? Ay, ito pala ay dun sa objectivity nung Because in history, you need to look at the authenticity of the texts, etc. So, they're saying that colonial discourse in Said does not ask these things, but actually just looks at how people are represented in the text. So, for example, if an author said something about Indian women, a historian would ask, is the representation accurate? But Said would ask, what does this representation or description of the Indian women say about the one who is writing the text? Okay, so they will have different questions. Yan. Yan. So the complaint that discourse forms a homogeneous totality that overrides the particularity of historical and geographical difference. Yun. Yung sinasabi kanina na parang ahistorical. He doesn't look at historical periods and takes everything as general. Okay? And then, the uniformity of the discursive regime of Orientalism, no Westerner can ever escape. So, Homi Bhabha, another thinker that we will be discussing, actually looked at this and said that he critiqued Said and said that actually not all Westerners are like that, not all colonizers are like that, and not all colonized peoples were represented in such a way. Okay, because there is colonial discourse that is heterogeneous and ambivalent. So it's not always negative. And if it is negative, it is not purely negative because of course, iba-iba naman yung history ng colonialism and imperialism. Na-establish na din ito natin last time na kahit na may ideas of colonialism and imperialism, iba-iba pa rin yung experiences ng mga tao, lalo na kung sila yung tatanungin mo. Okay? So, yun yung mga caveats and nuances na maaari nating idagdag dito sa mga na ito. So, ito na yung sinasabi ko na parang binawi niya yung sinabi niya na on representation. So, according to Young, he develops his idea of Orientalist discourse that operates on the level of representation and criticizes it on the level of misrepresentation of the real in a hegemonic power knowledge structure. However, he then acknowledges that it may be impossible for anyone to represent other cultures accurately anyway. So, that's a big critique for Said. Na because at the end of all of it, he says that, oh, it's impossible actually to represent other cultures. But what is important, okay, and I think it's also important to look at and recap, is his idea that the many things are not as objective as they seem. Okay? So, yun yung isa sa tingin ko na ano, na pinaka-contribution niya rin sa ano sa post-colonial studies. Okay? Because it is indeed a fact that the East is represented in a certain way, and this representation has been consistent through centuries, that it has persisted until the present. So, hindi natin masasabi na uh, hindi natin masasabi na coincidence talaga siya. Okay? Pero yun nga, the critique is that it's very generalizing. So, our task as scholars is of course to look at it in a specific context. So, yun yung ginagawa usually ng mga scholars applying Orientalism. They look at a specific historical period, or they look at a specific context. Okay? So, that could be uh, a remedy to that, a remedy or response to that critique. So, but also it's also a question that we could discuss, that is it really possible to represent other cultures accurately? So, for example, if you will be a consultant to a TV show, or you want to make art or make music, is it really possible to recognize all cultures accurately, to represent them accurately in such a way that there will be no backlash against you in the end? Okay. Another thing that is important that we can add here is that Said emphasized still the context on where these literary texts or colonial texts were produced. Okay, because it supports the idea of it supports the idea that colonized peoples were taken advantage of. They were muted. They were essentially invisible from history because other peoples, or the colonizers, were the ones who were representing them. Okay, so that's another point that I want you to take away from this presentation. Parang binawi niya yung. So that's it for Orientalism. So I know that maybe some parts would be kind of unclear. So I'm willing to discuss this again in our synchronous session. So I hope that you watch this and take notes, and compare it with the reading that I gave you. And we could add some details later on in our class. Maraming salamat.